Hi, and welcome to our Biohacking Village panel. My name's Mike Murray. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Scope Security. But more importantly, I wanted to pull this panel together because I'm really excited to hear the conversation that we have with all the folks on the call. And anybody who's dealt with medical device security over the last few years has probably heard the varying opinions that come from alternately the regulators, the medical device manufacturers, and the people who have to live with the regulation and the medical devices, the hospitals themselves. And so I thought it would be really great to put a panel together where we could have folks from the FDA, folks from the medical device manufacturers who have to build medical devices according to FDA regulations, and folks from the hospital who have to take the security patches and apply them to the devices and really get to the bottom of it. You know, the FDA has been long on record as saying security patches don't require FDA approval. And if you talk to the device manufacturers, they have a very different story. And if you talk to the hospitals, they hear both the FDA and the device manufacturers telling them different things. And they have to live in this ambiguity and, frankly, live with a risk that is hard to manage. So we want to get to the bottom of this. So today we have literally all three groups on the phone, and I'm not going to introduce the illustrious panelists. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. But maybe we can start with the folks from the FDA. Aftin, did you want to start by introducing yourself?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for giving us an opportunity to participate in the panel. My name is Aftin.Ross, and I'm a Senior Special Advisor for Emerging Initiatives in FDA's CDRH. I've had the opportunity to work on quite a few cybersecurity policy and collaborative initiatives over the last few years, so very happy to be on the panel today.
Matthew?
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Hazlett. I'm the Cybersecurity Policy Analyst within the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality within CDRH. So I work on cybersecurity policy development and implementation across the various review offices.
And our medical device manufacturer expert?
I am Tara Larson. I've been in medical device security for going on 15 plus years now. So I feel like I'm well versed enough to talk about this challenge and how it impacts both sides of the fence.
And now from the HDO side of the world, and actually, Erik, you've straddled both. You've actually led some regulatory style initiatives and worked on some projects there, and you're a CISO at a major health system. So maybe you want to start out.
Sure. So I'll start off with the day job. You know, the thing that gives me bread for my butter. That would be the CISO for Intermountain Healthcare, which is an integrated delivery network located in the mountain states. So primarily in Utah, Salt Lake City, that's the home base, but surrounding areas in Nevada, Idaho, and others. My pro bono work is what you just described. So I am a couple of things. On the Health Sector Coordinating Council, I am an executive committee member of the executive council there. And specifically within one of the task groups that is organized under that initiative, I'm the co-lead for the industry lead for the 405D initiative. 405D is a joint partnership with Health and Human Services. So I have a government counterpart, Julie Chua. We've been established for about 4 years now, produced a document called HICCUP, the Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices, which we talked about medical device security in there. And that was recently recognized as a cybersecurity best practice under a new law, Public Law 116.321, which ultimately amends HITECH and instructs the Office of Civil Rights to consider recognized practices during any enforcement actions. So long-winded way of kind of getting into some policy stuff, kind of getting into some of the industry stuff, but there's a lot of work that I do on that side.
Great. And last but not least, Sam.
Hi guys, I'm Dr. Samantha Jacques. I'm the Vice President for Clinical Engineering at McLaren Health. We're a 15 hospital system in Michigan and in Ohio. And my role is to maintain all the medical devices throughout our entire integrated system as well. So I too, like Erik, work very closely with the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council on their subgroup around legacy medical devices and devices that are no longer supported. So I appreciate, Mike, you're pulling us all together, and I'm ready to get started.
Me too. And so let's just dive right in. And FDA folks, the first one's to you. what does it mean when the FDA says security patches do not require FDA approval?
Thanks, Mike, for the question. And I think it's a very timely question to start the panel with. I'm going to start, and then I'll turn to my colleague, Matt, to add on. So first, I think it's very important that we emphasize that FDA's approach is really meant to benefit public health and safety by trying to incentivize manufacturers to respond quickly to identify and address cybersecurity concerns. We really think that doing so is in the best interest of patient safety, and patients really are at the center of everything that we do. And I think both the government and manufacturers can agree with that. FDA requirements sometimes were put forward as rationale for not addressing a cybersecurity vulnerability. And so we thought it was very important that we clearly articulate that FDA requirements should not be a barrier for addressing cybersecurity concerns. And we do this in a bunch of different ways, certainly in talks like this, but also on our webpage, we have a Mythbuster sheet, as well as in our guidance, where we have tried to incentivize in our guidance for manufacturers to, again, identify and address issues quickly. And really trying to emphasize in this that FDA does not typically need to review the changes that are being made as a result of a cybersecurity concern. And I'll turn to Matt now and let him talk a little bit more about those policy implications.
Sure, thanks, Aftin. So as she said, typically if a change is made solely to address the cybersecurity concern, those typically don't require an FDA submission. We definitely want to make sure that manufacturers are able to address cybersecurity concerns quickly and with as little regulatory oversight as needed. That being said, there definitely are instances where a submission may be required if there's a substantial change to the system. So if you're changing your authentication protocol, or if there's something where the change being made introduces other potential safety risks where FDA would be concerned about what those risks could impose on the patients, that's where you start getting into that area of FDA wanting to see that in a regulatory pre-market submission. That being said, we also do encourage that if manufacturers find themselves in that type of situation to reach out to us quickly, as we definitely want to facilitate those review processes when they're there as quickly as possible to ensure that we're not the long holdout in terms of the delay in getting those patches. We want to work with you on trying to get those released as quickly as possible.
Tara, you were smiling through that, and I think you knew I was going to call on you next, because I think especially a lot of our audience, and a lot of our audience has heard a lot of those sorts of points before, but very few of them probably understand what it's like on the inside of a medical device manufacturer to try and respond to this, right, and to try and be on that side of the fence. Maybe you can tell that story.
I'm not laughing out of disrespect. I promise I'm laughing because I'm like, oh, this is so common. I think the challenge, obviously, the medical device manufacturers, we would love to just push a patch out, but as Matt just said, it's not always that simple. Patches don't just patch an operating system. They manage services, they manage calls, they manage medical device functions, they manage multiple different things in that ecosystem. So if we patch something and we don't break, and we break it and we haven't tested it, now we've got a bigger problem. So that's why the timeliness is such a challenge. Is we have to test and we have to validate. Only then, when that process is completed, are we then able to say, we know that this is just a straight up security patch. And that way we can follow the FDA guidance for patching directly. If that patch impacts more than just cybersecurity, though, obviously we have to go through the submission process, working with our counterparts at FDA to kind of say, what is the balance here? What does the timeline look like? And work with them to do a submission or not do a submission to drive it. So the process internally to apply a simple patch is awesome, but it's never quite that simple. So then we get a lot of the feedback from customers asking, well, how come I just can't apply that patch? Well, because if you do and you break it, we have to go work with the FDA to understand what happened and why that happened. So that's where people hear about recalls happening. It's not necessarily recalls, but it's more a matter of what broke down and why didn't you catch it sooner? Does that?
Sam, how does that play out on the other side? Or Erik, whoever wants to jump in. I don't have to moderate everything. Whoever wants to jump in and respond to that, go for it.
So I appreciate Afton because she has a Mythbusters kind of mentality that goes on in the FDA. And I think one of the things that people don't understand on our side from the medical device side is, right, the myth is that there's one process for us to patch. There's not one process. There's probably 15 different processes that we have to follow. And so, right, if a vulnerability comes out, right, we can follow either a proactive or a reactive, right, stance. If it's proactive, right, and we know we have devices that are affected by this, obviously, we'll work with our MDM partners to try and figure out when, which is always our question. When am I going to get the patch? When is it going to be available? But if we don't necessarily know that the vulnerabilities were part of some of the devices we have, we might end up in a reactive stance where all of a sudden we'll just get a security patch that pops up right on a vendor portal or an email from a vendor saying, hey, you need to implement this. That communication can sometimes be very challenging, right? There's no standard way for MDMs and HDOs to communicate, which is very problematic in the security world. And then after we actually know something needs to be done, how you go about doing it is incredibly painful, right? So do my staff go out and physically touch every device? Does the vendor have to come out and we've got a schedule for them to touch every device? Patching in the medical device world is not like patching your laptop where IT can sit in the dark room and hit a button and via the network, everything goes out. 99% of our patches, you physically have to touch every device we have to patch it. And so the simplicity and the idea that patching is a panacea solution from a security perspective is just false. We can't patch everything. We don't have any ability to monitor and to proactively go out and say, all of this stuff needs to be patched to go ahead and reduce the risk we have. So we just end up juggling that risk the best we can.
Yeah, I totally agree. And to build on that, Sam, I think the reality that you'll understand also is medical devices aren't just in hospitals, they're in bodies, they're in homes. And until that gets connected, you can't apply that patch. So and we don't have the authority to say to somebody, you have to connect this system every day of your life. That's just not our right. So that's the other challenge that people don't always recognize.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in on this as well and talk about maybe two challenges in this space. So first of all, I certainly respect the progress that has been made over the last several years, both from the FDA providing very clear guidance on what we should be doing, to the MDMs coming to the table, and recognizing we've got to solve for the problem, and the HDOs honestly stepping up and saying, hey, this is part of our issue as well. 5-7 years ago, it was like a knuckle fight, drag out fight on who's doing what, who's responsible, and everybody was pointing at everybody else. So it's gotten way better. Like, that's not happening anymore. So that's good. There's some challenges. So, Sam just talked about the operational issues. I actually didn't know how hard it is on that side of the house to actually get the patch in. I want to sort of, from an HDO's perspective, there's obviously a lot of things that we need to do to protect devices. And, at the end of the day, the patch is the thing that we want to get in there to inoculate. It's like the vaccine, so we will put other risk compensating controls in place to make it work in a temporal, bridge type of solution. But we need an end state where the final patch can get deployed. We don't want patches to cause harm to the patients. We don't want it to, disrupt the clinical effectiveness of the device. There's obviously got to be quality control, and all of that stuff has to happen. One of the challenges that we have today is the signal for the criticality of that patch is entirely driven by the MDMs. So if there's a new vulnerability that pops out, and it's bad, maybe there's my gosh, there have been so many bad ones this year. I just can't. I'm so surprised by it, especially like so many 0 days within Microsoft and so forth. The MDMs will take this. Tara, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. The MDMs will take this, conduct the risk analysis, determine, pursuant to the FDA post-market guidance, determine if there's a underlying critical effectiveness, issue. And if it's deemed as an uncontrolled risk, then they'll go through their process of like emergency processes. If it's a controlled risk, it sort of falls into our normal cycle. Now, here's the problem. The uncontrolled risk is specifically, my mind's eye, is specifically designed around, can you tamper with the device to have the device cause direct harm? The issue that we are facing within HDOs is not so much the direct harm on the device connected to the person, as it is the device is part of an ecosystem that when it's weak, breaks the entire system. And then suddenly we're unable to care for our patients because that one device that's over here in a corner that was deemed as a controlled risk was used as a beachhead and blew through everything. And so we're not having the risk conversation at the ecosystem level, and the both post-market guidance isn't driven that way. The MDMs are talking about it again pursuant to the guidance, and then we're stuck with this sort of quagmire of vulnerability. And the answer is, well, just put a firewall in front of it and you're fine. And it's like, oh my God, and oh, by the way, us MDMs, we're going to use our remote access tools and we're just going to connect into that thing that you're not even going to know about it. And we're going to manage it. And so then I again go, oh my gosh, like how much stuff is happening in my environment that I don't even have visibility into, control over. And what happens if it's in the middle of an OR when a surgery is going on and we're not controlling for that. So that's my sort of challenging statement and of reality.
So I can build in a little bit. I think a lot of the larger MDMs, the bigger ones, not the small ones, the big ones are being really cognizant of that fact. And as they do their CSRAs, they're really looking to make sure that they don't become that pivot point into your network. Not just because patient harm, but they don't want the reputational risk either. I know that I've been pushing really hard for people to look at the entire ecosystem and not just the device itself. So we're trying to help. I agree that putting a firewall in front of it is a Band-Aid. It doesn't actually solve the problem. It just pushes it down the line longer. So I think the way to really solve that is as devices do more of the CSRAs, cybersecurity risk analysis, they need to look at all the way this ecosystem interfaces interact with that device. And then even if it's not being used for patient care at that point in time, they need to make sure that it's not being used as a way to get to another patient and care on another system. And I think that's what the CSAs are starting to really get to the bottom of. So I do see a lot of changes happening there, and I do think it's going to get a lot better soon.
So
and
FDA.
Let me build on that some more. Sorry.
Go
I think as you see more connected systems coming on board with IoT being in everything, you can't just say it's a standalone device anymore. Nothing is standalone anymore.
I mean,
especially
standalone. Everything connects to the EHR these days, pretty much, right?
Correct.
So, FDA folks, I've noticed we've started to talk about the post-market guidance. Erik brought up controlled and uncontrolled risk. There's probably a lot of people in the audience that don't actually understand the post-market guidance or what is different about controlled and uncontrolled risk and what even that means. And I don't know if you guys want to stop and explain and maybe talk a little bit about how that has gone, how that whole process has played out.
Sure. So largely when you're looking at controlled and uncontrolled, there are kind of these terms that we introduced in the post-market guidance to discuss the way to characterize the residual risk from the vulnerability. So if you're in the controlled level, you have an acceptable level of residual risk with the vulnerability existing in the system. And naturally, with uncontrolled, it's an unacceptable residual risk. So that increases the priority in which those issues should be addressed by the manufacturer. One of the common kind of misconceptions that we've seen with the implementation of the guidance is that some manufacturers will classify something as a controlled risk and they view it as, okay, this never needs to be addressed in my system ever. That's not the intention of the guidance. The guidance is meant to address the priority. So expressing the urgency with which a uncontrolled vulnerability needs to be addressed, definitely with the greater safety risk, those risks should be handled faster, but it definitely is not intended to be we're in the controlled section, this never needs to be addressed, and that definitely points to some of the discussions around the larger system. And definitely from the direction the FDA has been going and how we're addressing cybersecurity, both in the pre-market space and also in the post-market space, we're definitely looking at the larger ecosystem in more and more of our interactions. So a lot of our messaging is around looking at the end-to-end system, looking at all the different pieces that come into play, looking at those remote support interfaces, looking at the connections to the network, to the cloud, services that are being used. So we definitely are ramping up and increasing kind of our cybersecurity considerations beyond just the end device, and really looking at that system level approach of how these different elements come to impact those risks.
So in the post-market guidance, there was the 30 and 60-day timeframes for security assessment and patch delivery. Do you all believe that that's still an appropriate time frame? How is that working out in practice? And start with the FDA folks, but then I really want to talk about what that looks like on the inside of all these organizations.
Yeah, so I can start. So definitely from the standpoint of the 30-day timeline, 30, 60-day timeline, we know that there's very few instances where these criteria have been met to meet that enforcement discretion barrier of not issuing a recall. There's been a lot of maturity developing over the medical device sector since that guidance went out. I think when it came out, we knew that that was a high bar, but trying to drive that evolution from the ecosystem to better message and also start driving for movement from manufacturers to give them a reason to start to move faster, put that essentially an incentive there to drive culture changes to be able to more rapidly respond and address cybersecurity vulnerabilities as they come out. So definitely we acknowledge it hasn't been hit much. There's definitely been significant strides in the sector to drive in timelines and better approach being able to meet those thresholds. And definitely every vulnerability is different. You're not going to address every vulnerability in 60 days. We know that there's somewhere in order to develop a patch and be able to test and deploy it, it's just going to take longer with some of these different types of systems. If you have an implant, it's definitely a different time frame than if you're a software as a medical device application existing on a mobile phone. So there's different considerations there, but I think we're definitely seeing a lot of movement in terms of companies getting closer to that bar. But we definitely acknowledge that it was a aggressive change from the status quo when we released the guidance in 2016.
Tara, maybe you can shed some light on, and I'll throw some color in of my own. I remember when that guidance came out, I was still at GE, and I will say that the 30, 60-day thing almost provoked laughter in some of my colleagues, because when you get a vulnerability report for a product that was developed in 2008, and there's not anyone who's written a line of code on that product in a decade. Even finding someone who knows about the software can take more than 30 days. So I'd love to hear Tara's experience on that same sort of space.
Yeah. So, so I think, I was at a large manufacturer when the first guidance came out, and there was definitely a lot of, what are we going to do about this? And it wasn't that it was impossible, but like you said, there was code that people hadn't looked at in 15 years because they had all retired. So the challenge was not only finding someone who knew it, but figuring out what was actually going on to first of all assess if it was controlled or uncontrolled or whatever was going to happen. I think, fast forward 10 years from that point, or whatever, 5 years we're at now. But I think we're starting to see that while 30 and 60 days is not easily attainable, it has opened up the conversation to where now we actually have cybersecurity releases planned in our development cycles. We never had that before. So we are looking at all of those vulnerabilities that we're finding and scanning and our penetration tests, whatever else. And we're actually looking at all of that, finding ways to slot those in for development fixes, which is a huge improvement. I mean, I'm sure at GE, when you were there, Mike, you remember, we didn't have that R&D didn't think like that. R&D never considered going back and touching an existing product. That was a sustaining initiative, and that was somebody else's problem. So that mind shift shift has happened. Most medical manufacturers now have slotted plans where every release is planned to either bring in cybersecurity updates or address legacy cybersecurity design. So that's happening. Is it going to happen in 60 days? I don't know about that, because then it comes down to balancing the other product feature needs. So we're in that same conversation of balancing all of the needs of that feature set or product set, other customer asks, all the things that go into that. And I think that is where, we're seeing the improvements, but it's going to be more realistically every 6 months that we'll push out an update. And then you get into the whole marketing side of who pays for that and how that happens. But that is not on my plate. So I mean, yeah, I think it's definitely, it's better. It's getting better, but 60 days is going to be very difficult to meet.
I can
go for it.
Sorry, so I'll be brief, and then maybe. So something that I've done in my past lives was embedded that 30, 60, 90 into contract, which is always an interesting conversation when we got down with the MDMs. So some of the MDMs, and there's a lot, so some of them signed it, and they're like, yep, we'll do it. No problem. No questions asked. And the way that I did it, by the way, was stipulated uncontrolled risk, and then in that uncontrolled risk category, it's like straight out of the FDA, post-market guidance. You do this within 30 days, you do this within 60. The more sophisticated MDMs turned around and said, we're not actually required to fix this within 60 days for an uncontrolled risk. We'll recall. And so I responded back to that with, say like a linear accelerator, like we build rooms around linear accelerators. Like you're not recalling that thing, but and it's like, okay, so that's fine, but you're telling me now then that you've got essentially as much time as you possibly want to work through this issue. And what am I doing in the meantime? Oh, I'm just putting a firewall in front of it. And that's the mitigating control. So some vulnerabilities, that's fine. I know this is really old at this point in time, but when WannaCry happened many years ago, I was working with all the MDMs to try to get the patch installed for the underlying issue there, and none of the MDMs deemed that as an uncontrolled risk. And I responded back with, I'm sorry, this was like at the time the most impactful cyber attack that the globe has ever faced, and you don't see that as an uncontrolled risk. So so again, still in a little bit of this state of flux of like, what's the actual reality here and how we define it. I will say though, just to be positive, the MDMs have actually done a really good job of notifying and pushing patches and notifying customers of this is something that needs to happen because of our own determinations of risk. So they haven't ignored the issue. It's really more of a precision point, I think, at this point. Anyways, yeah. Sam.
Yeah, so I agree with your beginning points, because that's exactly what I was going to say, right? Like, I completely agree 100%, but I'm going to disagree with your last point, because I do think the MDM ecosystem out there is very different as you go from MDM to MDM. You have a true bell curve. There are ones that are out there leading, trying to get us to where we need to be, and truly partnering with HDOs to sign agreements and get us communication channels and figure out how that goes. And then you have MDMs that really haven't started that process that Tara talked about. We still don't have, security as a forethought. We don't have security as part of design. And there's stuff rolling off the construction belt today that I'm purchasing today, where we have MDMs that still haven't bought in. They haven't figured it out. And we have to deal with those just as well as we have to deal with the ones that are ahead of the curve. And so, the majority of them, I would tend to agree, we're moving in the right direction. But those of us in the HDO world, we've got to deal with all of it, not just one individual MDM. And that can be incredibly challenging when you're trying to mitigate risk on an ecosystem level.
This is Aftin. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tara.
No, go ahead, please.
So I wanted to respond to one point from Erik and then one point from Sam. So the first thing I just wanted to clarify is that a recall does not necessarily mean removal. There are lots of different ways that you can address a recall. And a lot of those actually involve the product potentially staying right where it is and having some other fixes that don't necessitate it coming out. So I just want to make sure that one point is clear. And then with regard to, what Sam, is saying about there being, a bell curve of manufacturers with regard to their maturity. This is part of the reason why we have said from the very beginning that we think that collaboration is key here, because there are a lot of different maturity levels in the various stakeholder groups that we have from the MDM side, from the hospital side, and that's why we think collaborations that have happened, for example, under some of the different healthcare sector coordinating council efforts, some of the work that Erik helped to co-chair and lead through the 405D, and the other collaborative, workshops and things that are happening. It's very important for the ecosystem as a whole to be engaged, so that if you have a little bit less experience, you can get some additional insights from those who might have a little bit greater maturity. And I think that that has been one of the benefits for our sector. Part of the reason we have made such positive progress in a relatively short amount of time is because there has been a lot of collaboration among those who have a little bit more maturity, trying to bring along those who might not have as many resources or as much awareness, to try to level the playing field a little bit. But certainly there's still quite a bit of work to do.
Maybe I could throw a bit of a ball into the air and see if it would be caught. So there was awesome work that was done under the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council, specifically around product lifecycle and security product lifecycle management of medical devices, the Joint Security Plan. And Aftin was a co-lead on that. And we had representation, from HDOs, the MDMs, and the FDA. Why can't that just be a requirement? Why do we have to fight for that on that bell curve for those who haven't adopted, those who are rejecting, and look at that and say, well, that's nice guidance, or I'm not going to use the word guidance because that means something very specific in federal parlance. That's a nice idea, but we're not, focused on that. I find that in some cases you just need, the rules to be set, and then that's where it goes. So is it possible?
No. No, it is possible. Here's the challenge, and I'm just going to speak freely. So Mike left medical devices and went to go start his own company, and after that, everyone else left too. We have a resource problem. I get calls constantly from those smaller manufacturers asking if I can come work for them or consult for them or do whatever else. And obviously I can't because of other issues, but there's just not enough people that do it. And the challenge is medical devices aren't enterprise security. And until you can make that shift in your mind to understand that you don't own where this thing is going to live, it's very hard to design security in, and people don't have that skill set. So it's a huge challenge for the smaller manufacturers, but so that's why we have to use those frameworks and all the other things that we've done in the last 5 years to help them understand how to at least build it without having dedicated cyber folks. They just don't have those people, and there's just not enough of them out there. I think that there's a lot happening in some of this, well, at least here in the Twin Cities at the university level, to get more people focusing on just medical device security, because it's such a huge challenge. And that's, I think, honestly, what the problem is going to be, is resources.
So I'm throwing a random question in here because it's ultimately the HDOs who have to live with all of these levels of maturity. Like how Sam and Erik, how do you live with, I have one vendor that issues my patches within 60 days, and I have another vendor who has decided that there's no such thing as an uncontrolled risk in their world unless the entire machine explodes, and so I never issue patches. Like you all live with the insecure things on your network every day. What do you do?
So I can start. I think ultimately, just like the medical device manufacturers, we have to risk rank things, right? Everything is a risk, and you've got to figure out what the highest risk is, and that's what we're going to truly focus on. But right, in Erik's perspective, I agree with him. Ultimately, everything sits in an ecosystem. And I could argue the point that even if I don't risk rank one device high, it's still an entry point to my network, and it can completely take down our entire system. And so, we struggle truly on a daily basis when we look at risk to decide what we're going to focus our resources on, because Tara's right, we don't have enough resources as well on the HDO side. We need to figure out what truly is the risk we're willing to accept. And I hate to tell you, everything else falls off the table, right? And we'll get to it someday. And we hope that there's not going to be an issue. And we hope is not a plan. Like, we're all very aware that hope is not a plan, but we have no other mechanism at this point besides hope. And so, we'll do the best we can, and we have been for years. And everybody on this panel is correct. It's getting better. It's better than it's been in the last 5 years, but it's still not great. I don't even know if I'd call it good at this point.
Yeah, so I'll plug Hiccup here for a second, and then I'll talk about reality. Um, so Hiccup practice 9 talks about medical device security, and you can almost think about it as like hygiene. There are absolutely things that we have to do within the HDOs. We have accountability. Network segmentation, changing default passwords, inventorying, and having asset components. Understanding the vulnerability posture of these things. These are all things that we need to do exactly what Sam just talked about. We have to treat medical devices as part of an IoT, ecosystem. Just like, we're concerned on the medical devices, and we're also concerned with the cameras that are connected onto the network and the building, HVAC systems. I mean, you could think about it this way: you could break into a building HVAC system, crank up the heat in an OR, and suddenly, boom, you got a huge problem on your hands. So that's, there is a pathway, there is a statement, a document that you can pick up and follow, and you should. The challenge that we have is a telemetry issue and an operational issue. So there's so much of these devices that are out there, and having visibility into those in real time is a big problem. And it all starts with that inventory, and how accurate you can keep it in real time through automation. And Sam, I'm sure, knows hard. So there's that, right? And CMMS systems are very good at helping with that, and should be used. Then it's a segmentation issue, and this is where I'm going to call it an operational challenge. It's a process problem. So you have things that should be segmented, but segmenting means that you need to actually understand flows and data paths and all of that in order for it to work. Or sometimes things just magically show up on a general access network because, lo and behold, it's accessible. And so then you're playing this game of trying to understand where it is, where it's at, and yank it out and move it over. And these are cat and mouse games, and it's hard to play, and you need systems to be able to do that. So, I mean, there are tools that are out there these days that do discovery and can help you sort of understand placement. You have to have solid architecture in the HDO to know where your segment zones are. You got to have solid education with your clinical engineering folks, your architecture folks, and everybody, with your supply chain people. So as things are coming in, you know where they're going and how you're tying it together. And it's, I'm going to just call this a standard process issue. You can set all the right designs, but you gotta apply that scrutiny on this continually. Otherwise, entropy enters the system, and things just happen.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about the past, and we talked a lot about the present. Let's talk a little bit about the future. So FDA folks, there's a new pre-market draft guidance that is on the way at some point. There's also the recent executive order pushing the use of SBOM. How do you all see the future of this, and especially those two developments, but anything else you all are working on? How is that going to change the HDO experience? How is it also going to change the MDM experience as time goes forward?
Sure. I can start. I'll probably start with discussing the guidance and then pivot to Aftin on some of the SBOM pieces. In terms of the pre-market guidance, definitely there's been a lot of discussion across the sector around getting the revised pre-market guidance out. We've indicated previously that we'll be re-releasing it in draft. From a high level in terms of what we're looking at in terms of the guidance, definitely clear messaging in terms of cybersecurity as a part of your safety and effectiveness evaluation, that when you're looking at these device risks, safety and effectiveness are the core of what FDA's evaluation of cybersecurity are. Definitely looking at end-to-end connections and the various use cases of how cybersecurity risk can impact the system. Definitely threat modeling and looking at the entire system for identification of threats and mitigations is definitely central to both how FDA is approaching reviews currently, and also will be central to how we're looking at things moving forward. I think kind of one of the largest characterizations is the current 2014 final guidance that's out there is very high level. It says essentially you should be addressing cybersecurity in your risk management. I'd say that this next revision is definitely going into far more detail around exactly what those documentation expectations are, exactly what those design considerations are going to be. If you consider the 2014 guidance to be an X-ray of cybersecurity, this is the MRI. We're definitely getting into the details, getting into the nitty-gritty in terms of how both cybersecurity fits into design considerations, but also how it fits into the quality system regulation compliance aspects. Aftin, do you want to take the SBOM piece?
Absolutely. And you're going to hear a similar, I think, refrain with regard to some of the things I'll say about, SBOM here, similar to how we worked in other challenging areas for medical device cybersecurity. Certainly have tried to take a collaborative approach here as it relates to SBOM as well, trying to get feedback and insights from various stakeholders by participating in different collaborative efforts. We recognize really very much the criticality of having an SBOM because it helps organizations understand their cybersecurity risks and whether or not they might be impacted. And this is critical to taking action if you don't even understand potentially what's in your system, what's in your network. And so we have been very much a proponent of SBOM and have participated in a lot of collaborative activities such as NTIA's software transparency activities as it relates to the healthcare proof of concept. And think there have been definitely some strides made as a result of that, because basically this group said, we're not going to sit here and debate all the hows. Let's just talk about what it needs to do, and let's actually pressure test it and see what we get out of it. I think that really has helped to make a lot of positive progress, because now we're not talking about if we need a SBOM, but we're talking about actually how to do it, how to operationalize it. We also, on FDA's side, recognize that cybersecurity bits are not constrained to the U.S. and that this is cybersecurity is an international challenge. So we've also been working as a co-chair of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum on a cybersecurity work group that's actually working on a work product related to SBOM as well as a best practice, trying to get additional insights out to the global community as it relates to that, because we know it's easier, in particular for some of the larger multinationals, to have some regulatory, convergence on what at least some of the general principles are going forward. And so we definitely think, SBOM is one of those items. And then even thinking about, what's been happening, nationally with some of the recent executive orders that have come out, such as the one on improving the nation's cybersecurity, which includes SBOM as a component. I know that that one is very much, focused, has one component that's talking about how do you enhance the software supply chain security, and SBOM certainly is called out there. And while this might not be explicitly, directed to an individual sector, because it's focused on the government working together with the private sector as it relates to government systems, certainly as various parts of critical infrastructure are implicated here, that this has downstream implications for other parts of critical infrastructure as well. And there can only be benefits for the health sector as a whole if we all think about the power of an SBOM and how that can help us increase our maturity, our response, our risk assessment to better, again, protect patients, which is all of our goals.
So Tara, I know SBOM especially has some implications for medical device manufacturers. What are your thoughts?
I have many. SBOM has actually been a blessing and a disguise, and I say that kindly, actually, because it forced medical device manufacturers to really look at what they're using in their design. It forced people to simplify, because if they started to have to maintain the SBOM for all of these devices, it got pretty big. So for me, I'm using it in my future designs as a way to reduce complexity, to say, you know what, let's only use stuff that we know has a good supply chain behind it so that we don't have to manage more vendors. Let's actually use this to make our designs better. So that's what I'm using it for. On the other hand, the other side of that is, oh my God, we found a lot of stuff out there that has not been, people use open source software for everything. And that's been a challenge because to help to the HDOs, when they say you have to give us an SBOM, it's like, oh, okay. So you're giving them this SBOM with open source software in there that, hasn't been touched in a long time. And that opens up a lot of uncomfortable conversations of how you're managing that. So I think it's really helped open up our eyes as to what's actually gone on in the past, in the cowboy way, if you will, and what are we going to do about it in the future to make it so that we actually have less intensive designs and less complexity in our system, so that we do know what's actually in there, so that when a vulnerability does happen, we can say with 100% certainty that it is either controlled or uncontrolled, and what we're going to do about it. That's the part of it. Personally, what I would love to see from my friends at the FDA, though, is to get this guidance out, because the uncertainty of everything going on is giving design teams the ability to say, well, we don't have that yet. We don't have that enforced yet. So we need that so that we can continue making the progress to go forward. Because the SBOM's in there and they're like, well, no one said anything we have to do yet. It's like, yes, it's coming. We know it's coming. We know it's going to be the MRI, if you will. And we need that because that detail's got to be there again. So please hurry, please. But that's just my 2 cents. I mean, SBOM is good and bad. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to it, and I fully support doing it, actually.
I don't think there's anyone that wants this guidance out faster than FDA does. I am, trust me.
I know, Matt. I know. I'm sorry.
Anything I can do, I am doing it.
Let me know if I can help.
The HDO folks, how do you plan to use SBOM? I mean, I think I have a hunch, but let's hear what you're thinking as far as some of this new stuff that's coming out.
So I can let Erik go first because, my perspective is very operational, right? I want to see it because it's going to be very helpful to us, but I also manage a ridiculous number of manufacturers and a ridiculous number of devices. So I have truly operational concerns about how I'm going to ingest this information and actually mine it for useful pieces of data. I really want to start having some initial conversations with CMDB and CMMS vendors, right? How are we going to make this easy? Because at this point, we're going to get it and it's going to be great when we first get it. And then we're going to have a stack of paper this high trying to figure out, okay, well, again, how am I going to risk rank, right, when everybody gives me the same type of information? It's not going to be in the same format. It's not going to be, easily ingestible. So, I applaud all the work moving towards, right, an SBOM, because that's exactly where we need to go. But we still have work to do from an operational perspective on actually making it very useful for those of us in the HDO world.
That's exactly where I'm at, Sam. So I've seen some early iterations of SBOMs that some of the leading manufacturers have produced, and it's pretty cool, seeing sort of the format of it and the componentry of it. And we now have a massive data problem, which is, how does this all tie? I mean, I actually, to a degree, think about it as like the passive vulnerability scanners of old, like old Nessus, if you recall. It did banner grabs. There was a database in the back end. It said, these are the vulnerabilities of this particular system, spits out a report, and then you go out and rationalize that, and you're like, oh, now the banner was off, or, oh, that we didn't update that field, sorry, and so the reality of the vulnerability was sort of in question at times. I don't want to poo-poo the initiative, though. I mean, it is absolutely the first step in unpacking the problem. But now we have a large data problem that has to come at hand. And I agree with Sam, this is entirely like an operational challenge. So we need a consistent way of bringing this in from multiple sources. We need trust and fidelity of the data elements itself to know that it's actually up to date and accurate. So whatever that cycle is going to be that the MDMs are going to be producing this, is it going to be the same 30, 60, 90 patch cycle? I mean, are you, when there's a new component that happens, does it automatically push and come over, or do we have to wait a quarter or two, for that information? So there's a lag sort of challenge inside of it. We all, like I said at the beginning, we have issues just around inventory in the first place, so like tying into the inventory and all of that. And then the telemetry associated to it. Now, there are there are products that are out there that are already thinking about this. You know, there's like the medical device specific IoT management devices that are out there already trying to understand the flows and the vulnerability status of those things. And those, you know, those more forward thinking companies are looking at how to incorporate SBOM into the mix of all of that. And that's exactly what they should be doing. You know, my perspective is I'm looking for a service or a product that's going to manage all that work underneath it for me, because back to the challenge of resources that we had before, if we have to put people on this, you know, to pick apart all the data inside of it, I don't know, you know, so, and then I'll say, you know, I predict, putting my future lens in place, that we're going to come back to some of the same challenges that we have today, which are the SBOM is going to expose a vulnerability, and there's going to be a disagreement about, is that vulnerability controlled or uncontrolled? And then we're going to be going back to the manufacturers and having the same conversation again. We just have more data, you know, at our hands, which is good. We always should have more data. But we're going to have to work out a new process on sort of what that means.
All right, we're coming up on time, and I want to leave a couple minutes for everyone to go around. We're going to go around, and I want you all to do two things. One or two sentences of the point you want to leave the audience with, and then more importantly, where can the audience find more of each of you? Because I'm sure there are people who are going to want to talk to you all on social media or email or find you out in the world, and so. We'll go around, and maybe we can go in a different order. I'm just going to go sort of counterclockwise. Sam, let's start with you.
Yeah, so probably the one thing to take away from this is, you know, we've made progress, right? I don't think any of us on this panel can disagree with the fact that it is a vastly different ecosystem than it was 5 years ago, but we still have a long way to go. And so I think these types of talks, getting the information out there so that everybody understands exactly where we are and exactly where we want to go, is the best thing we can do at this point. We need to continue to communicate and collaborate, and we need to continue to make things better and easier for all of us in this entire ecosystem. So thank you, Mike, for putting this together. That's awesome. You guys can find me. I'm at McLaren. My first name's Samantha. My last name Jacques at McLaren, or I'm on LinkedIn if you guys want to connect on LinkedIn. That's great.
Matt.
Sure. I'd say from my standpoint, definitely in terms of the sector's getting better, I'd say manufacturers are doing significant culture changes. That continuing support, to Tara's point earlier, was not really built into the business model. So companies have been doing a lot in terms of changing their team configurations to support devices. So that's definitely a critical piece to getting patches out quickly. So where you've come a long way, but still have a ways to go. And definitely, I think in terms of the broader ecosystem, with the threats that we're seeing, with all of the different attacks we've been seeing in healthcare, it's only going to be a more critical process moving forward. And I think that the industry is going to have to continue to step up and make sure that we're able to address these vulnerabilities quickly to ensure that patient safety is continued. In terms of finding me, I'm on LinkedIn or my FDA email, which is easily findable because government employees. So either of those locations.
Tara.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that the divide that we used to have 5 years ago between manufacturers, FDA and HDOs has gotten a lot smaller, and not a moment too soon, because as we move to connected care and everything that we do, we've got to continue that partnership. I think our engineers internally are much more advanced now at understanding cybersecurity, and they definitely realize that they have to do it, and that's been huge. I mean, I personally got to watch this journey, and believe me, it's huge that those engineers are now on board. I think going forward, that partnership and engineering background is going to just be necessary. And that's going to help people be able to grow cybersecurity internally and not have to have dedicated cybersecurity resources for every team. That's going to be the way it goes forward. And if you want to find me, I'm on LinkedIn. Everyone knows where to find me.
Erik, you're up.
I would just encourage you to look at the health industry cybersecurity practices, or HICCUP. Practice 9 is the medical device security state. You know, HGOs, we have an obligation here, and that is your path if you haven't set a path yet. If you could find it by Google 405D, HHS 405D, it'll take you to phe.gov, and the publication is located there. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's mostly where I'm located. I have like the tiniest of Twitter presence. I haven't really gotten into Twitter yet, but I am Erik Decker 13 on Twitter. You'll see that I have like 5 people following me. It's better to follow me on LinkedIn.
And the last word to Aftin.
Thanks, Mike. So I think that my last words are going to really focus on the whole reason that we're all here, that we all recognize that medical device cybersecurity really is a patient safety issue, and it's complex and challenging, which means that we need to continue these multi-party, multi-stakeholder collaborations to bring forward the different viewpoints so that we don't build tools, processes, or bring on people that are not going to benefit what actually some of our key challenges are. And so really want to make sure that we're actually building solutions that will be helpful in advancing us forward and continue to accelerate the pace at which we are acting, because the threats continue to accelerate. And so we've got to try to match that pace as much as we can. And then for me, certainly you can find me at my FDA address, my name at fda.gov. And then also we have a team cybersecurity mailbox too that's staffed by several people, cyber med at fda.hhs.gov. And that's also a good way to get in touch with the team. And certainly, like everyone else, are on LinkedIn. And I'm like Erik, I haven't got to Twitter yet.
All right, I'm going to wrap this up and say thank you again to all of you. I know how busy each and every one of you are doing the work of healthcare cybersecurity. So to take an hour to talk to me and to this audience is incredible, and I thank you all again. Also, let's just shout out for a second how awesome it is that this even exists, and the work that Nina and all of the folks behind the Biohacking Village have put in over the years. 10 years ago, this would have been... this forum didn't even exist for us to all come together and for people to even want to listen to us. So real shout out to Nina and the work of that whole team. And thank you for having all of us. And thank you to the audience for showing up and listening to us all. So thanks again, everybody. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot more in the future.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Enjoy the
Bye.
conference.